Chapter 5. The Persian Conquest and Final Transformations. The year 539 BCE marked a turning point that would echo through history like thunder across the ancient world. King Nabonidus sat in his palace in Babylon, perhaps gazing at the mighty walls that had protected his city for generations, unaware that the greatest empire the world had ever seen was about to crumble not through violence, but through something far more revolutionary: acceptance. The Persian king Cyrus the Great was marching toward Babylon, but this would not be a conquest in the traditional sense. Instead, it would become one of history's most remarkable examples of how power can change hands through ideology rather than bloodshed. Cyrus had already carved out an empire stretching from the edges of India to the shores of the Mediterranean, but Babylon represented something special. This was not just another city to conquer, it was the heart of Mesopotamian civilization, the keeper of ancient wisdom, and the economic powerhouse that controlled trade routes connecting the known world. The Persian king understood that taking Babylon by force would destroy the very thing that made it valuable. Instead, he chose a path that would revolutionize how empires were built and maintained. The Babylonian people had grown weary of their king Nabonidus, who had spent years away from his capital, living in the Arabian oasis of Tamar, while his son Belshazzar ruled in his absence. This absence had created a spiritual crisis, because the king was supposed to perform the sacred New Year ceremonies that ensured the gods' favor. Without these rituals, many Babylonians believed their city was cursed. The priests of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, felt particularly abandoned as their god's worship had been neglected in favor of the moon god Sin, whom Nabonidus preferred. When Cyrus approached Babylon, he carried with him not just armies, but a message that would change everything. His scribes had crafted proclamations declaring that he came not as a conqueror, but as a liberator chosen by Marduk himself to restore proper worship and justice to Babylon. This was revolutionary propaganda at its finest, turning what should have been a military invasion into a religious restoration. The Persian king claimed that Marduk had called him to save Babylon from the neglect of Nabonidus, making him not a foreign invader, but a divinely appointed savior. The psychological impact of this message cannot be overstated. For the first time in Near Eastern history, a conqueror was positioning himself as the defender of local traditions rather than their destroyer. Previous conquerors had typically imposed their own gods and customs on defeated peoples, but Cyrus promised to restore and protect Babylonian religious practices. This approach was so unprecedented that many Babylonians found it more appealing than their current situation under their absent king. As Cyrus's army approached the gates of Babylon, something extraordinary happened. The city opened its doors without a fight. Guards laid down their weapons, priests came out to welcome the Persian king, and the people lined the streets not in fear, but in celebration. The Babylonian Chronicle, a contemporary record, describes how Cyrus entered the city in peace and how the people scattered green branches before him. This was not just a surrender, it was an invitation. The moment Cyrus entered Babylon marked the beginning of what historians call the bloodless revolution. The transfer of power was so smooth that daily life continued almost unchanged. Markets remained open, temples continued their services, and children played in the streets as if nothing had happened. Yet everything had changed. The independent kingdom of Babylon, which had dominated Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years, had become part of a Persian empire that stretched across continents. Cyrus immediately set about fulfilling his promises in ways that must have seemed miraculous to the Babylonians. His first act was to restore the worship of Marduk with proper ceremonies, something Nabonidus had neglected for years. Persian soldiers helped repair temples that had fallen into disrepair, and the king personally participated in religious festivals, showing respect for Babylonian traditions that even some Babylonian kings had ignored. But the most revolutionary aspect of Cyrus's policy was his treatment of exiled peoples. For generations, the Babylonians had followed the practice of deportation, moving conquered peoples far from their homelands to prevent rebellions. Thousands of Jews, captured during the destruction of Jerusalem decades earlier, lived in exile in Babylon. Cyrus announced that all exiled peoples could return to their homelands and rebuild their temples with Persian financial support. This policy was so unprecedented that it seemed almost unbelievable to those who heard it. The most famous record of this policy is the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document discovered in the ruins of Babylon that modern scholars often call the world's first charter of human rights. Written in Akkadian, the ancient language of Mesopotamia, the cylinder records Cyrus's promises to restore displaced peoples and their gods. The text declares that Cyrus gathered all the scattered peoples and returned them to their homes, rebuilt their sanctuaries, and restored their gods to their proper places. This was not just royal propaganda. Archaeological evidence shows that Cyrus actually carried out these promises. The Jewish people were among the most significant beneficiaries of this policy. The Persian king issued a decree allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, providing them with gold and silver from the royal treasury to fund the reconstruction. This act of generosity was so remarkable that Jewish texts remember Cyrus as a Messiah, a term meaning anointed one that was usually reserved for Jewish kings. The book of Isaiah calls him the Lord's anointed, showing how deeply this Persian policy affected Jewish religious thinking. This religious revolution had profound implications beyond just the restoration of temples. By positioning himself as the protector of all religions within his empire, Cyrus created a new model for imperial rule. Previous empires had tried to impose unity through cultural uniformity, forcing conquered peoples to adopt the customs and gods of their conquerors. Cyrus chose the opposite approach, creating unity through diversity by allowing each people to maintain their own traditions while being loyal to the Persian crown. The integration of Babylon into the Persian administrative system was equally revolutionary. Rather than dismantling Babylonian institutions, Cyrus incorporated them into his own governmental structure. Babylon became a satrapy, a Persian province, but one with remarkable autonomy. The satrap or provincial governor was often a Persian nobleman, but he relied heavily on Babylonian administrators who understood local customs and languages. This administrative integration brought about an economic revolution that transformed how commerce worked across the ancient world. The Persians introduced a standardized silver currency system that made trade easier across their vast empire. Babylonian merchants, who had always been skilled traders, suddenly found themselves with access to markets stretching from India to Egypt. The old Babylonian shekel was gradually replaced by Persian silver pieces. But the change was implemented so gradually that it caused minimal disruption to daily commerce. The Persepolis treasury tablets, administrative documents found in the Persian capital, provide fascinating insights into how this integration worked in practice. These tablets record payments to workers from across the empire, including many Babylonians who traveled to Persepolis to work on royal construction projects. Skilled Babylonian craftsmen, particularly those who worked with metals and precious stones, were highly valued throughout the Persian Empire. Some tablets record Babylonian astronomers and mathematicians being employed at the Persian court, showing how intellectual skills were recognized and rewarded. Cultural synthesis became one of the most remarkable aspects of life in Persian period Babylon. Persian artistic styles began to influence Babylonian art, while Babylonian knowledge of astronomy and mathematics influenced Persian science. Greek merchants and diplomats, who had previously been rare in Mesopotamia, became common sights in Babylonian markets as Persian policies opened new trade routes. This mixing of cultures created a cosmopolitan atmosphere unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. The Persian period saw remarkable advances in Babylonian astronomy and mathematics. Persian patronage allowed Babylonian scholars to pursue their studies with unprecedented resources. The famous Babylonian astronomical texts that later influenced Greek and Islamic astronomy were largely developed during this period. Persian kings, particularly Darius I, were fascinated by Babylonian knowledge and provided generous funding for scholarly research. However, this period of cultural flowering and peaceful integration was not destined to last forever. The seeds of future conflict were planted in the very success of Persian rule. As generations passed, some Babylonians began to feel that their cultural identity was being diluted by Persian influence. Young Babylonians who had grown up under Persian rule sometimes felt disconnected from their ancient heritage, while older generations worried about the loss of traditional ways. These tensions came to a head during the early years of the 5th century BCE, when the Persian Empire faced internal struggles following the death of Cyrus's successor, Cambyses. The succession crisis that brought Darius I to power created opportunities for provincial rebellions, and Babylon became the center of the most serious challenges to Persian authority. The first major rebellion occurred in 522 BCE, led by a man who claimed to be Nebuchadnezzar III, supposedly a descendant of the great Nebuchadnezzar II, who had built the Hanging Gardens and conquered Jerusalem. This rebel understood the power of nostalgia and tradition in Babylonian culture. He proclaimed himself the rightful king of Babylon, promising to restore the independence and glory of the old Babylonian Empire. The rebellion was carefully planned and well organized. Nebuchadnezzar III managed to gain control of several important cities in Mesopotamia, and even minted coins bearing his name and the traditional Babylonian royal titles. His supporters included many priests and nobles who felt that Persian rule, despite its benefits, had reduced Babylon to a mere province of a foreign empire. They dreamed of returning to the days when Babylon was the center of the world, not just another satrapy in someone else's empire. However, revolutionary nostalgia proved no match for Persian military efficiency. Darius I moved quickly to suppress the rebellion, using both military force and political cunning. He offered pardons to rebels who surrendered and employed Babylonian allies who remained loyal to Persian rule. The rebellion collapsed within months, and Nebuchadnezzar III was captured and executed. The failure of this first rebellion did not end Babylonian dreams of independence. In 484 BCE, another pretender calling himself Nebuchadnezzar IV launched an even more ambitious revolt. This second rebellion was more widespread and better organized than the first, suggesting that discontent with Persian rule had grown rather than diminished over time. Nebuchadnezzar IV's rebellion coincided with other revolts across the Persian Empire, including serious uprisings in Egypt and Asia Minor. For a moment it seemed possible that the entire Persian Empire might fragment into its constituent parts. The rebel king managed to control most of Mesopotamia for several months, and even began diplomatic negotiations with other rebellious provinces. This second rebellion was more than just a political uprising. It represented a cultural revolution against Persian influence. The rebels destroyed Persian symbols and monuments, attempted to restore pre-Persian legal codes, and emphasized the ancient Babylonian traditions that they claimed the Persians had corrupted. They portrayed themselves as the defenders of authentic Babylonian culture against foreign contamination. But this rebellion also failed, and its failure had more serious consequences than the first. King Xerxes, who had succeeded Darius I, decided that Babylon's repeated rebellions showed that the policy of cultural tolerance had been a mistake. His response was swift and devastating. Persian armies not only crushed the rebellion militarily, but also carried out what amounted to a cultural punishment revolution that would forever change Babylon's relationship with its own heritage. The most symbolic and devastating aspect of Xerxes' punishment was the destruction of Marduk's statue. This golden image of Babylon's patron god had stood in the Esagila temple for over 1,000 years, serving as the physical embodiment of the city's divine protection. According to Babylonian religious belief, the god actually lived in the statue, making its destruction not just vandalism, but deicide. When Persian soldiers melted down the golden image, they were symbolically killing the god of Babylon. The destruction of Marduk's statue sent shockwaves throughout Mesopotamia that reverberated for generations. Without the statue, the traditional New Year ceremonies could not be performed properly, because the king was supposed to take the hand of Marduk during the festival. This ritual, which had been performed for centuries, symbolized the divine approval of royal authority. Its impossibility meant that legitimate Babylonian kingship, in the traditional sense, had ended forever. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the extent of Persian retribution. Excavations have uncovered destruction layers in several Babylonian cities, showing buildings burned and walls torn down. Persian records indicate that many Babylonian nobles were executed or exiled, while others were forced to relocate to distant parts of the empire. The rebellion's failure marked the end of Babylonian political independence in any meaningful sense. Yet even this harsh punishment did not completely destroy Babylonian culture. The Persian administration, while less tolerant than before, still needed Babylonian expertise in administration, trade, and scholarship. Many Babylonian practices continued, but now under closer Persian supervision. The great libraries of Babylon remained active, and Babylonian astronomers and mathematicians continued their work, though always under the watchful eye of Persian overseers. The Persian period in Babylon lasted for over 2 centuries, long enough for several generations to grow up knowing no other system of government. Persian became the language of administration, though Akkadian remained the language of scholarship and religion. Many Babylonian families intermarried with Persian settlers, creating a mixed population that embodied the cultural synthesis that characterized the later Persian Empire. During this long period of Persian rule, Babylon gradually transformed from a conquered city into an integral part of the Persian world system. Babylonian merchants traveled freely throughout the empire, Babylonian scholars worked at the Persian court, and Babylonian religious practices influenced Persian spiritual beliefs. The city remained wealthy and important, but it was no longer the independent power it had once been. This transformation was nearly complete when news arrived in 334 BCE that would change everything once again. Alexander of Macedon, a young king from the edges of the Persian Empire, had crossed into Asia with an army and was marching toward the heart of Persian power. What the Babylonians could not have known was that this Greek invasion would mark the end of Mesopotamian independence forever and begin a new chapter in world history. Alexander's approach to Babylon was different from Cyrus's, but equally revolutionary in its own way. Where Cyrus had presented himself as a restorer of tradition, Alexander came as a bringer of new ideas. His army carried not just weapons, but Greek philosophy, art, and scientific knowledge. The cultural revolution that Alexander brought would prove even more transformative than the Persian conquest had been centuries earlier. When Alexander arrived at the gates of Babylon in 331 BCE, the city once again opened its doors without a fight. The Persian satrap, recognizing that resistance was futile, surrendered the city and its treasury to the Macedonian conqueror. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph, but his triumph was different from Cyrus's peaceful entrance. Where Cyrus had been welcomed as a liberator, Alexander was received as a conqueror, albeit a benevolent one. Alexander's treatment of Babylon revealed his own revolutionary approach to empire building. Like Cyrus, he respected local traditions and participated in Babylonian religious ceremonies. But unlike the Persian king, Alexander also brought with him a vision of cultural fusion that went beyond mere tolerance. He encouraged his soldiers to marry local women, adopted aspects of Persian court ceremony, and planned to make Babylon one of the capitals of a new world empire that would blend Greek, Persian, and local traditions. The Hellenization of Babylon began immediately after Alexander's conquest. Greek became the language of the elite, Greek architectural styles influenced new construction, and Greek educational methods were introduced alongside traditional Babylonian learning. Yet this was not simply cultural imperialism. Alexander's vision involved a genuine synthesis of cultures rather than the dominance of one over others. Alexander's plans for Babylon were ambitious beyond anything previously imagined. He intended to rebuild the city as a magnificent capital worthy of his world empire, with new harbours, expanded temples, and administrative buildings that would surpass even the greatest Persian constructions. Greek architects worked alongside Babylonian engineers, combining Greek aesthetic principles with Mesopotamian practical knowledge. However, fate intervened to cut short these grand plans. In 323 BCE, after returning from his campaigns in India, Alexander fell ill in Babylon and died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. The astronomical diaries, Babylonian records that tracked important events alongside celestial observations, provide detailed accounts of Alexander's final days and death. These documents describe how the great conqueror was brought to Babylon sick with fever, how his condition worsened despite the efforts of both Greek physicians and Babylonian healers, and how he died in the summer heat of Mesopotamia. Alexander's death in Babylon was deeply symbolic. The man who had conquered the known world died in the same palace where Nebuchadnezzar II had once planned his own empire. The room where Alexander breathed his last had witnessed the rise and fall of Babylonian kings, Persian satraps, and now the Greek conqueror who had brought them all to an end. It was as if the ancient city was reclaiming one final victim from those who had sought to rule it. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death plunged his empire into chaos. His generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, fought bitter wars over the inheritance of his conquests. Babylon found itself passed from one Greek ruler to another as these successors carved up Alexander's empire among themselves. The city that had once been the centre of its own empire was now merely a prize to be won or lost in the struggles of foreign dynasties. Under the Seleucid dynasty, which eventually gained control of most of Alexander's Asian territories, Babylon experienced a gradual decline. The new rulers preferred to build their own capitals rather than maintain the ancient Mesopotamian cities. Seleucia on Tigris, built near Babylon, began to drain away population and commerce. The great city that had survived Assyrian sieges, Persian conquests and Greek invasion, was finally defeated not by armies, but by neglect and economic competition. The transformation of Babylon during the Persian period and its conquest by Alexander marked the end of an era that had lasted for over 3 millennia. Mesopotamian civilization, which had given the world writing, law, astronomy and mathematics, would never again be politically independent. The cultural and intellectual traditions that had developed in the land between the rivers would continue to influence world civilization, but they would do so as part of larger Greek, Roman and later Islamic empires, rather than as the products of independent Mesopotamian states. Yet the story of Persian Babylon and its conquest by Alexander also demonstrated the resilience of cultural identity. Despite centuries of foreign rule, Babylonian traditions persisted. Astronomical observations continued to be recorded in cuneiform script long after Greek and Aramaic had become the languages of government. Religious practices that had begun in the 3rd millennium BCE continued into the Hellenistic period, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining their essential character. The Persian conquest of Babylon and the subsequent Greek conquest represent one of history's most significant examples of how empires can transform not just through military conquest, but through cultural assimilation and adaptation. The bloodless revolution of 539 BCE showed how propaganda and ideology could be more powerful than armies, while the rebellions of the early 5th century demonstrated that cultural identity could survive even the most benevolent foreign rule. Alexander's conquest and death in Babylon symbolized both the triumph of Hellenistic civilization and the end of Mesopotamian independence, marking a transition that would reshape the ancient world forever. Chapter 6. Cultural and Religious Revolutions. Throughout Babylonian history, long before any modern revolution changed the world, the ancient land between two rivers witnessed transformations that would echo through centuries. In the fertile valleys where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers converged, a series of quiet but profound revolutions unfolded over thousands of years, reshaping how humans communicated, worshipped, understood the cosmos, and organized their societies. These were not revolutions of blood and battle, but revolutions of the mind and spirit that began in the great city of Babylon and spread across the known world. The Writing Revolution. The story begins with wedges pressed into clay. When the first Sumerian scribes developed cuneiform writing around 3200 BCE, they could hardly have imagined they were starting a revolution that would transform human civilization. The earliest cuneiform signs were simple pictures representing concrete objects like barley, cattle, or water. A drawing of a fish meant fish, and a drawing of a bird meant bird. But as the centuries passed, something remarkable happened. The scribes began using these signs not just for the objects they depicted, but for the sounds those words made when spoken. This breakthrough came when scribes realized they could use the sign for ti, which meant arrow, to also represent the sound tai, in other words, even if those words had nothing to do with arrows. Suddenly, abstract concepts like love, fear, or justice could be written down. The revolution had begun, transforming writing from a simple accounting tool into a medium capable of capturing the full range of human thought and emotion. When the Akkadian-speaking peoples rose to prominence around 2334 BCE under Sargon of Akkad, they encountered this Sumerian writing system and faced a challenge. Their language was completely different from Sumerian, belonging to a different language family entirely. Sumerian was an isolated language with no known relatives, while Akkadian belonged to the Semitic family, related to Hebrew and Arabic. Yet rather than abandon cuneiform, the Akkadians adapted it with remarkable ingenuity. The Akkadian scribes kept many Sumerian signs for their original meanings, but added new pronunciations that matched Akkadian words. They also created new signs specifically for sounds that existed in Akkadian but not in Sumerian. This adaptation was so successful that Akkadian became the international language of diplomacy and trade throughout the ancient Near East for over 1,000 years. Letters written in Akkadian cuneiform have been found from Egypt to Iran, from Turkey to the Persian Gulf, showing how this writing revolution spread far beyond Mesopotamia. But the writing revolution did not stop there. As centuries passed and new peoples entered Mesopotamia, cuneiform continued to evolve. The Babylonians, who were themselves Akkadian speakers, refined the script further. They simplified many signs, making them easier to write and read. They also developed new ways of organizing texts, creating the world's first libraries and archives. In the Great Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets were systematically organized by subject, creating the first comprehensive knowledge repository in human history. The most revolutionary aspect of Babylonian writing culture was the establishment of scribal schools throughout the empire. These schools, called tablet houses, were where young boys learned the complex art of cuneiform writing. The curriculum was rigorous and took many years to complete. Students began by learning the basic signs, practicing on clay tablets that could be smoothed and reused. They copied classical texts, studied mathematics, and learned the art of letter writing. By the time they graduated, they were masters of literacy in a world where writing was a rare and precious skill. These scribal schools became centers of cultural preservation and innovation. The teachers preserved ancient Sumerian texts by copying them and creating Akkadian translations. This translation movement was perhaps one of the most important cultural revolutions in human history. Sumerian literature, including epic poems like Gilgamesh, creation myths and religious hymns, survived not because they were carved in stone, but because generation after generation of Babylonian scribes carefully copied and translated them. The Widener God list provides a perfect example of how this cultural continuity worked. This ancient text, which lists hundreds of gods and their attributes, was first compiled in Sumerian, but was continuously updated and translated into Akkadian throughout Babylonian history. Each new version added contemporary gods while preserving ancient ones, creating a bridge between past and present that kept Mesopotamian religious traditions alive for over 3,000 years. As the Babylonian Empire evolved, so did its writing. When Aramaic-speaking peoples became more prominent in the later periods of Babylonian history, cuneiform began to compete with the Aramaic alphabet. Aramaic was written with a much simpler alphabetic script on papyrus and parchment, making it faster and cheaper to use than cuneiform on clay tablets. Gradually, Aramaic became the common language of trade and daily communication, while cuneiform remained the language of scholars, priests, and official documents. This transition marked the end of one writing revolution and the beginning of another. The alphabetic principle, which reduced writing to a small set of signs representing individual sounds, eventually replaced the complex syllabic systems like cuneiform. Yet the impact of the cuneiform revolution continued to influence human civilization. The very concept of preserving knowledge in writing, of creating schools to teach literacy, and of translating texts between languages all began in ancient Mesopotamia during this great writing revolution. The religious revolutions. While scribes were revolutionizing writing, priests were revolutionizing religion. The most dramatic religious transformation in Babylonian history was the rise of Marduk from a minor local deity to the supreme god of Mesopotamia. This transformation did not happen overnight, but unfolded over centuries, reflecting the political and cultural changes that reshaped the ancient world. In the earliest periods of Mesopotamian civilization, each city had its own patron deity. Enlil ruled in Nippur, Enki controlled Eridu, and Inanna held sway in Uruk. Babylon, which started as a small settlement on the Euphrates River, had its own local god named Marduk. Archaeological evidence suggests that Marduk was originally associated with agriculture and water, appropriate deities for a city that depended on river trade and irrigation farming. For centuries, Marduk remained a relatively minor figure in the vast pantheon of Mesopotamian gods. Everything changed when Hammurabi made Babylon the capital of his empire around 1792 BCE. As Babylon's political power grew, so did the status of its patron god. The priests of Marduk began to claim that their deity deserved recognition not just as the god of Babylon, but as the ruler of all gods. This was a revolutionary claim in a religious system where gods were traditionally tied to specific cities and regions. The theological revolution reached its climax with the composition of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. This masterpiece of ancient literature told the story of how Marduk defeated the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and created the world from her body. But the Enuma Elish was more than just a creation story. It was a sophisticated piece of religious propaganda that justified Marduk's supremacy over all other gods. The epic cleverly incorporated older Sumerian and Akkadian creation myths while placing Marduk at the center of cosmic events. According to the story, the older gods were unable to defeat Tiamat and save the universe from chaos. Only Marduk possessed the wisdom, courage, and power necessary to restore order. After his victory, the grateful gods proclaimed Marduk their king and gave him 50 names representing all his various powers and attributes. This theological innovation was revolutionary because it solved a major problem in ancient religion. How could a single empire worship hundreds of different gods from different cities without creating religious conflict? The Enuma Elish provided an answer by creating a hierarchy with Marduk at the top. Local gods were not eliminated but were redefined as servants or aspects of the supreme deity. This allowed conquered peoples to continue worshipping their traditional gods while acknowledging Marduk's ultimate authority. The process of religious syncretism that elevated Marduk was equally revolutionary. Rather than simply replacing older gods, Marduk absorbed their attributes and powers. He became the god of wisdom like Ea, the god of war like Nergal, and the god of justice like Shamash. Temple hymns from different periods show this gradual accumulation of divine powers. Early hymns praise Marduk as a local god of agriculture and fertility. Later hymns celebrate him as the creator of the universe and the source of all divine authority. Archaeological evidence from Babylon shows how this religious revolution affected daily worship. The Esagila temple, Marduk's main sanctuary, was repeatedly expanded and renovated as the god's importance grew. Inscriptions found in the temple foundations record donations from kings and wealthy citizens who wanted to honor the supreme deity. The annual Akitu festival, which celebrated Marduk's victory over chaos, became the most important religious ceremony in the Babylonian calendar, drawing pilgrims from across the empire. The rise of Marduk also influenced Babylonian law and politics. Kings claimed to rule by Marduk's divine authority and portrayed themselves as the god's earthly representatives. The famous Code of Hammurabi begins with the king declaring that Marduk commanded him to establish justice in the land. This connection between religious and political authority became a model that would influence later civilizations, including the divine right of kings in medieval Europe. But religious revolution in Babylon was not limited to the rise of Marduk. The pantheon continued to evolve throughout Babylonian history as new peoples and new ideas entered Mesopotamian culture. During the Neo-Babylonian period, Persian religious concepts began to influence Babylonian thought, introducing ideas about cosmic dualism and the struggle between good and evil. These concepts would later influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, showing how Babylonian religious innovations continued to shape human spirituality long after the empire itself had fallen. The Scientific Revolution. While priests were transforming religion, Babylonian scholars were revolutionizing humanity's understanding of the natural world. The scientific revolution that began in Babylon was perhaps the most profound intellectual transformation in ancient history, laying the foundations for mathematics, astronomy, and empirical observation that would influence human knowledge for millennia. The Babylonian approach to science was fundamentally different from that of their predecessors. Where earlier civilizations had explained natural phenomena through mythology and divine intervention, Babylonian scholars sought to find patterns and make predictions based on careful observation and mathematical analysis. This shift from supernatural to natural explanations marked the beginning of what we now recognize as scientific thinking. Babylonian astronomy began with practical needs. Farmers needed to know when to plant and harvest crops, priests needed to schedule religious festivals, and kings needed to choose auspicious dates for important events. To meet these needs, Babylonian astronomers began keeping detailed records of celestial events. They noted the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, tracked the phases of the moon, and recorded unusual phenomena like eclipses and comets. What made this revolutionary was not just the observations themselves, but the mathematical methods the Babylonians developed to analyze them. They discovered that celestial events followed predictable patterns that could be expressed in mathematical terms. By the 8th century BCE, Babylonian astronomers could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They had calculated that eclipses followed an 18-year cycle called the Saros, and they used this knowledge to forecast eclipses decades in advance. The mathematical innovations that supported this astronomical revolution were equally groundbreaking. Babylonian mathematicians developed the first place-value number system, which used the position of a digit to determine its value. This system, based on the number 60, was far more efficient than earlier systems that required separate symbols for each number. With place-value notation, complex calculations that had been impossible before became routine. Babylonian mathematicians also developed sophisticated algebraic methods for solving mathematical problems. They created what we would now recognize as quadratic equations and developed techniques for finding square roots and calculating compound interest. Cuneiform tablets from Babylonian schools show that students were learning mathematical concepts that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Perhaps the most famous example of Babylonian astronomical achievement is the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, which records the movements of the planet Venus over a 21-year period during the reign of King Ammisaduqa in the 17th century BCE. This tablet contains the earliest systematic astronomical observations in human history, recording the dates when Venus appeared as a morning star, disappeared behind the sun, and reappeared as an evening star. These observations were so accurate that modern astronomers use them to help establish the chronology of ancient Mesopotamian history. The Babylonian division of the sky into 12 zodiacal signs was another revolutionary innovation that would influence human culture for thousands of years. The zodiac was originally a practical tool for astronomical observation, dividing the path of the sun into 12 equal sections to make it easier to track celestial movements. Each section was associated with a constellation, and the entire system was used to create a standardized calendar and to predict the positions of planets. This zodiacal system was based on careful observation and mathematical calculation. Babylonian astronomers had determined that the sun took approximately 365 days to complete its journey through the zodiac, and they used this knowledge to create a calendar that balanced lunar months with the solar year. The sophistication of this system is evident in the fact that it is still used today, with only minor modifications, in modern astrology and astronomy. The scientific revolution in Babylon also included advances in medicine and engineering. Babylonian physicians kept detailed records of symptoms and treatments, creating the first medical textbooks in human history. They developed surgical techniques, identified various diseases, and created pharmaceuticals from plants and minerals. Babylonian engineers designed sophisticated irrigation systems, built massive temples and palaces, and created the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The impact of the Babylonian scientific revolution extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Greek philosophers and mathematicians, including Pythagoras and Thales, traveled to Babylon to study with Babylonian scholars. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge they acquired there formed the foundation of Greek science, which in turn influenced Roman, Islamic, and eventually modern European science. The 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, and the zodiacal calendar that we use today all trace their origins to Babylonian innovations. The legal and social revolutions. The final revolution that transformed Babylonian civilization was perhaps the most fundamental of all. The gradual transformation of law and society that reshaped how people lived, worked, and related to one another. This social revolution unfolded over more than 2 millennia, reflecting the changing needs and values of Babylonian civilization as it evolved from a small city-state to a vast empire. The story begins with Hammurabi's famous law code, created around 1750 BCE. While Hammurabi's code was not the first written law in Mesopotamian history, it was the most comprehensive and influential. The code contained 282 laws, covering everything from property rights and commercial transactions to family relationships and criminal punishment. What made this revolutionary was not just the scope of the laws, but the principles that underlied them. Hammurabi's code established the principle that justice should be predictable and uniform. Before written law codes, justice depended on the personal judgment of kings and local officials, leading to inconsistent and often arbitrary decisions. By codifying laws and making them public, Hammurabi created a system where people could know in advance what behavior was expected and what punishments would follow violations. This concept of rule of law was revolutionary and would become a foundation of civilized society. The code also reflected the social structure of early Babylonian society, with different punishments for different social classes. Free citizens, commoners and slaves were treated differently under the law, with more severe punishments for crimes against higher status individuals. While this seems unjust by modern standards, it represented an advance over earlier systems where the powerful could act with complete impunity. As Babylonian society evolved, so did its legal system. By the Neo-Babylonian period, thousands of legal documents show how dramatically law and society had changed since Hammurabi's time. Commercial contracts became increasingly sophisticated, reflecting the growth of international trade and banking. Property law evolved to accommodate new forms of ownership and investment. Family law adapted to changing social conditions and economic realities. One of the most significant aspects of this legal evolution was the gradual improvement in women's rights. While women in Hammurabi's time had limited legal standing, evidence from later periods shows that Babylonian women gained considerable economic and legal independence. Neo-Babylonian contracts show women owning property, conducting business, and participating in legal proceedings as equals with men. The Murasu Archive, a collection of family documents from the 5th century BCE, provides remarkable insight into how women's roles had evolved. The archive shows women managing agricultural estates, lending money at interest, and making independent business decisions. Some women became wealthy merchants and landowners, controlling substantial resources and employing dozens of workers. This level of economic independence was extraordinary for the ancient world and represents a genuine revolution in gender relations. The evolution of slavery in Babylonian society was equally dramatic. Early Babylonian slavery was primarily based on prisoners of war and their descendants. Slaves were considered property and had no legal rights. However, as Babylonian society became more complex and commercial, the nature of slavery changed significantly. Debt slavery became increasingly common as economic pressures forced free people to sell themselves or their family members to pay debts. However, Babylonian law developed protections for debt slaves that did not exist for war captives. Debt slaves could own property, conduct business, and buy their freedom. Some debt slaves became wealthy and powerful, even while technically remaining enslaved. The practice of manumission, or freeing slaves, also became more common during the Neo-Babylonian period. Masters could free slaves for good service, and slaves could purchase their freedom with money they had earned. Some manumitted slaves became successful merchants and even slave owners themselves, showing the fluid nature of social boundaries in later Babylonian society. The Kundalanu archive provides detailed evidence of these changing social structures. This collection of family documents from the 7th century BCE shows how a single family navigated the complex social and economic changes of their time. The archive reveals marriages between different social classes, business partnerships between former slaves and free citizens, and the gradual accumulation of wealth and status across generations. These social changes were not limited to the wealthy and powerful. Archaeological evidence from ordinary Babylonian homes shows improvements in living standards, changes in family structure, and evolution in social customs. Houses became larger and more comfortable, with specialized rooms for different activities. Artistic evidence shows changes in clothing, hairstyles, and personal decoration that reflect changing social values and increasing prosperity. The legal system also evolved to accommodate religious and ethnic diversity as the Babylonian Empire expanded to include people from many different cultures. Legal documents show that foreign residents could maintain their traditional laws and customs while still participating in Babylonian economic and social life. This legal pluralism was revolutionary for its time and helped explain how Babylon could successfully govern such a diverse population. The impact of these legal and social revolutions extended far beyond Babylon itself. The principle of written law codes influenced legal development throughout the ancient world, from the Hebrew Bible to Roman law. The concept of women's property rights and business independence provided a model that would not be matched in many cultures until modern times. The evolution from harsh class-based punishment to more nuanced and flexible legal remedies contributed to the development of more humane legal systems. By the end of Babylonian civilization, the society that had emerged was dramatically different from the one that had existed in Hammurabi's time. Social mobility had increased, women had gained substantial rights and opportunities, and the legal system had evolved to balance individual freedom with social order. These changes represented a genuine social revolution that transformed not just how Babylonians lived, but how they thought about justice, equality, and human relationships. The revolutions that transformed Babylonian civilization were not the dramatic political upheavals that often capture historical attention. Instead, they were gradual transformations in writing, religion, science, and society that unfolded over centuries and millennia. Yet, their impact was profound and lasting, shaping not just Mesopotamian civilization, but the entire course of human development. The writing revolution gave humanity the tools to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. The religious revolution provided new ways of understanding the relationship between gods and humans. The scientific revolution laid the foundations for empirical observation and mathematical analysis. The social revolution demonstrated that societies could evolve toward greater justice and opportunity. Together, these revolutions created the foundation for what we recognize as civilization itself. They showed that human societies could change and improve, that knowledge could accumulate and advance, and that the future could be better than the past. In the clay tablets and ruined temples of ancient Babylon, we can see the beginning of the long journey toward the modern world. A journey that began with wedges pressed into clay by scribes who could never have imagined the revolutions they were starting. Chapter 7. The Legacy Revolution. Babylon's Eternal Impact. Long after the mighty walls of Babylon crumbled into dust and the last Babylonian king surrendered his crown, something remarkable happened that would echo through the corridors of time for thousands of years. The true revolution of Babylon was not in its conquest of lands or accumulation of wealth, but in how its ideas, discoveries and wisdom spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in civilizations that had never seen the great ziggurat of Marduk or walked the famous processional way. This was the legacy revolution, perhaps the most profound and lasting transformation that ancient Babylon would achieve. When Alexander the Great died in the royal palace of Nebuchadnezzar in 323 BCE, he left behind an empire that stretched from Greece to India, but more importantly, he had created bridges between worlds that had previously existed in isolation. The Greek scholars who came in the wake of Alexander's conquests were not mere conquerors seeking gold or land, but hungry minds thirsting for the accumulated wisdom of centuries. In the great libraries and temples of Babylon, they discovered treasures far more valuable than silver or precious stones. These were the mathematical tablets that contained solutions to complex problems, astronomical records that traced the movements of planets with stunning accuracy, and medical texts that described treatments for ailments that had puzzled physicians for generations. Picture a young Greek scholar named Apollodorus walking through the streets of Babylon in 280 BCE, during the reign of the Seleucid kings who had inherited this portion of Alexander's empire. The city was no longer the supreme power it had once been under Nebuchadnezzar, but its schools and temples still hummed with intellectual activity. Apollodorus carried with him papyrus scrolls and writing implements, ready to copy down the wisdom he encountered. In the temple of Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom, he found Babylonian priests who had spent their lives studying the movements of the stars and planets. These priests, descendants of the astronomers who had served the great kings of old, possessed records that stretched back over 700 years, a continuous thread of observation and calculation that no Greek city could match. The transmission of knowledge from Babylon to the Greek world was not a simple matter of copying texts from one language to another. It required a deep understanding of different ways of thinking about the world. Babylonian mathematics, for instance, used a base 60 number system that was completely foreign to Greek mathematical thinking, yet it was incredibly sophisticated and practical. When Greek scholars like Hipparchus encountered Babylonian astronomical records in the 2nd century BCE, they discovered that these ancient observers had identified patterns in celestial motion that the Greeks had never noticed. The Babylonians had calculated that eclipses followed an 18-year cycle, had predicted the return of comets, and had developed methods for calculating the positions of planets that were startlingly accurate. The process of translating Babylonian knowledge into Greek created a revolution in Greek science and philosophy. Ptolemy of Alexandria, writing his great astronomical work, the Almagest, in the 2nd century CE, relied heavily on Babylonian observations that were already ancient when he consulted them. He acknowledged his debt to these unnamed Babylonian astronomers, whose careful records had been preserved for centuries in the archives of temples and schools. Without this Babylonian foundation, the sophisticated astronomical models that would guide navigation and calendar-making for over 1,000 years could never have been developed. But the flow of knowledge did not stop with the Greeks. When the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries CE brought Arab scholars into contact with the remnants of ancient learning, they discovered that the Babylonian tradition had survived in various forms. In the great translation movement that centered on Baghdad, the new capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, scholars worked feverishly to preserve and translate works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit and other languages. Baghdad, built on the banks of the same rivers that had nourished Babylon, became the heir to the intellectual tradition that had begun in the ancient city. The Islamic scholars who worked in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad during the 9th century CE found themselves grappling with the same fundamental questions that had occupied Babylonian priests and astronomers over 1,000 years earlier. How do you predict eclipses? How do you calculate the area of irregular fields? How do you determine the best times for planting crops? The answers developed in ancient Babylon, filtered through Greek scholarship and enhanced by Persian and Indian knowledge, formed the foundation for what would become the Islamic golden age of science and mathematics. Consider the story of al-Battani, a Muslim astronomer of the 9th century CE who worked in the region that had once been the heartland of the Babylonian Empire. Al-Battani used instruments and methods that could trace their ancestry back to the ziggurats, where Babylonian priests had made their nightly observations. He refined the calculations of stellar positions that had been begun by Babylonian astronomers, corrected errors in Ptolemy's work using techniques derived from ancient Mesopotamian mathematics, and produced astronomical tables that were used by navigators and scholars for centuries. In his work, the intellectual tradition of Babylon lived on, transformed but unbroken. The revolution in knowledge transmission was not merely technical or scientific. The very idea that human beings could understand and predict natural phenomena through careful observation and mathematical calculation was itself a Babylonian contribution to world civilization. Before the systematic astronomy and mathematics of Babylon, most cultures viewed natural events as the unpredictable actions of capricious gods. The Babylonian Revolution was to recognize that behind apparent chaos lay discoverable patterns, and that human intelligence could grasp these patterns and use them for practical purposes. While this intellectual revolution was spreading across the ancient world, another transformation was taking place that would prove equally profound and lasting. The Babylonian exile of the Jewish people in the 6th century BCE had created a crisis that forced a complete rethinking of religious and cultural identity. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and carried away the leading citizens of Judah to Babylon, he unknowingly set in motion a revolution in religious thought that would eventually transform not just Judaism, but the entire Western world. The Jews who found themselves in exile in Babylon faced a spiritual crisis unlike anything their ancestors had experienced. For centuries, their religious life had centered on the temple in Jerusalem, with its elaborate sacrificial system and priestly rituals. In Babylon, thousands of miles from their homeland, they had to discover new ways of maintaining their relationship with their God. The synagogue, as a place of worship and study that did not depend on animal sacrifice, was born during this period. The careful preservation and study of religious texts became more important than ever before, leading to the development of detailed scriptural interpretation that would characterize Jewish scholarship for millennia to come. But the Babylonian exile did more than change Jewish religious practices. It fundamentally altered how the Jewish people understood their place in the world and their relationship with God. In Babylon, they encountered a cosmopolitan civilization that worshipped many gods and had sophisticated mythologies that explained the creation of the world and the origins of human civilization. Some of these Babylonian stories bore striking resemblances to traditions that the Jews had preserved in their own oral and written literature. The Babylonian flood story, recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, shared remarkable parallels with the biblical account of Noah's Ark. Creation myths from Babylon describe divine beings bringing order out of primordial chaos, themes that resonated with the opening chapters of Genesis. This encounter with Babylonian civilization forced Jewish thinkers to articulate more clearly what made their faith distinctive. If other peoples had flood stories and creation myths, what was special about the Jewish versions? The answer that emerged during the Babylonian exile would prove revolutionary. The Jewish God was not merely one among many divine beings, but the only true God, the creator and ruler of all existence. Other gods were not competitors to be defeated, but false idols with no real power. This strict monotheism, refined and clarified during the Babylonian period, would become the foundation not only of later Judaism, but also of Christianity and Islam. The prophetic literature that emerged during and after the Babylonian exile reflected this theological revolution. Prophets like Ezekiel, who prophesied among the exiles in Babylon itself, developed elaborate visions of divine judgment and restoration that drew on Babylonian symbolism while proclaiming the supremacy of the Jewish God. The Book of Daniel, set during the Babylonian period, presented Babylon as the archetypal worldly empire that opposes God's kingdom. This vision of history as a struggle between divine and human power, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world, would profoundly influence later Jewish and Christian thought. When the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE and allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their homeland, they brought with them not just their physical possessions, but a transformed understanding of their faith and identity. The Judaism that emerged from the Babylonian exile was more sophisticated, more systematic, and more universalist than what had existed before. The idea that the Jewish God was the God of all nations, who used even pagan empires like Babylon and Persia to accomplish divine purposes, opened the door for the later Christian mission to the Gentiles and the Islamic conquest of much of the known world. The symbolic power of Babylon in Jewish and Christian thought cannot be overestimated. Babylon became the symbol of worldly power and pride, the city that represented everything that opposed God's rule. When the author of the Book of Revelation wanted to describe the corrupt earthly powers that persecuted Christians, he called them Babylon the Great. When medieval Christians wanted to criticize the luxury and worldliness of their own societies, they compared them to ancient Babylon. When Protestant reformers attacked the Catholic Church, they called Rome the Babylonian captivity of the true Church. The historical Babylon had become a powerful symbol that could be applied to any situation where human pride and power seemed to challenge divine authority. This symbolic revolution had practical consequences that extended far beyond religious thought. The idea that earthly empires were temporary and ultimately subject to divine judgment provided a framework for understanding political change and social upheaval. When the Roman Empire fell, Christian thinkers could interpret this catastrophe not as the end of civilization, but as the inevitable fate of all earthly kingdoms. When Islamic armies conquered Christian territories, Muslim scholars could see this as evidence that God was working through history to establish justice and true religion. The Babylonian model of empire rise and fall became a template for understanding the rise and fall of all human institutions. While the intellectual and religious legacies of Babylon were spreading across the ancient and medieval worlds, the physical remains of the great city were slowly disappearing beneath the sands of Mesopotamia. By the time of the Islamic conquests, Babylon was little more than a collection of ruins, its location known mainly to local inhabitants who used its ancient bricks for building material. For over 1,000 years, the greatest city of the ancient world existed mainly in memory and symbol, a legendary place whose actual physical reality had been forgotten by most of the world. Then, in the 19th century, something extraordinary happened that would create yet another revolution in human understanding. European explorers and archaeologists, armed with new techniques of excavation and filled with romantic notions about recovering the lost civilizations of the Bible, began to dig systematically in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations and transformed forever the way human beings understood their own history. The story of modern archaeology's encounter with ancient Babylon reads like an adventure novel filled with larger-than-life characters, dramatic discoveries, and moments of revelation that changed everything. In 1843, a young French diplomat named Paul-Émile Botta began excavating at a site in northern Mesopotamia that would prove to be the ancient Assyrian capital of Dur-Sharrukin. The sculpted reliefs and inscribed tablets he uncovered were unlike anything that had been seen in Europe, providing the first tangible evidence of the great Mesopotamian civilizations described in the Bible. News of Botta's discoveries created a sensation in European intellectual circles and launched what would become known as the heroic age of Near Eastern archaeology. Following Botta's lead, other archaeologists began systematic excavations at sites throughout Mesopotamia. Austin Henry Layard worked at Nimrud and Nineveh, uncovering the palaces of Assyrian kings and their vast libraries of cuneiform tablets. Henry Rawlinson deciphered the great inscription of Darius at Behistun, providing the key to reading Akkadian cuneiform. And in 1899, Robert Koldewey began the systematic excavation of Babylon itself, a project that would continue for nearly 2 decades and reveal the physical reality behind the legendary city. The most dramatic moment in this archaeological revolution came in 1872, when a young British museum employee named George Smith was working his way through tablets from Layard's excavations at Nineveh. As he translated the cuneiform text on one particular tablet, Smith realized that he was reading a version of the flood story that was remarkably similar to the biblical account of Noah's Ark, but clearly much older. The implications were staggering. If the Babylonians had their own version of the flood story, what did this mean for the biblical account? Was the Bible dependent on earlier Mesopotamian traditions, or were both accounts preserving memories of the same ancient event? Smith's discovery of what came to be known as the Flood Tablet created a revolution in biblical scholarship and religious thought. For the first time, scholars had concrete evidence of the cultural connections between ancient Israel and the broader Near Eastern world. The Bible, it became clear, had not emerged in isolation, but was part of a rich tradition of ancient Near Eastern literature and thought. This realization forced a complete reconsideration of how the biblical texts should be understood and interpreted. The archaeological revolution continued to gain momentum throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Each new discovery seemed to confirm the historical accuracy of biblical accounts, while simultaneously revealing the complexity and sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The Code of Hammurabi, discovered in 1901, showed that the ancient Babylonians had developed sophisticated legal systems centuries before the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. Tablets from the archive of Nebuchadnezzar's palace mentioned by name several of the Jewish exiles described in the Bible, providing independent confirmation of the biblical account of the Babylonian exile. Perhaps most importantly, the archaeological revolution revealed that human civilization was far older and more complex than anyone had previously imagined. The cuneiform tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites preserved records of astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, legal proceedings, commercial transactions, and literary works that demonstrated the intellectual achievements of peoples who had been virtually unknown to the modern world. The Babylonians and their predecessors, it became clear, had developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, literature, and urban civilization itself thousands of years before the rise of Greece and Rome. This archaeological revolution coincided with and contributed to broader changes in how human beings understood their place in history. The discovery of deep geological time, the theory of biological evolution, and the revelation of the true antiquity of human civilization all combined to create a new sense of the vast sweep of human experience. Babylon, once known mainly as a symbol of pride and decadence, was revealed to be one of the foundational civilizations that had made possible all subsequent human achievement. The decipherment of cuneiform writing was itself a revolution that deserves special attention. For over 1400 years, the ability to read the wedge-shaped writing of ancient Mesopotamia had been completely lost. The cuneiform tablets that occasionally turned up in the ruins of ancient cities were mysterious artifacts whose contents remained locked away. The breakthrough came through the patient work of scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend, Henry Rawlinson, and Jules Oppert, who used bilingual inscriptions and careful linguistic analysis to crack the code of this ancient writing system. The ability to read cuneiform transformed our understanding of ancient history. Suddenly, the voices of ancient Mesopotamians could be heard directly, without the filter of later Greek or Roman historians. Babylonian kings could speak for themselves about their achievements and their worldview. Ordinary people could be heard complaining about taxes, negotiating business deals, or expressing love and grief in personal letters. The Epic of Gilgamesh emerged as one of the world's great literary masterpieces, comparable to Homer's epics, but composed centuries earlier. Mathematical tablets revealed that Babylonian scribes had developed sophisticated algebraic techniques and had even discovered what would later be known as the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. As the 20th century progressed, the archaeological revolution continued to yield new insights into the complexity and achievement of ancient Babylonian civilization. Excavations at sites like Ur, Mari and Kanesh revealed the extent of Mesopotamian trade networks, the sophistication of administrative systems, and the richness of cultural and intellectual life. The discovery of libraries and archives provided unprecedented insight into how knowledge was preserved and transmitted in the ancient world. The decipherment of different dialects and periods of cuneiform writing allowed scholars to trace the development of ideas and institutions over thousands of years. The modern rediscovery of Babylon created its own legacy revolution, one that continues to this day. The realization that human civilization has a history stretching back over 5,000 years, and that some of our most fundamental institutions and ideas have their roots in ancient Mesopotamia, has transformed how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. The archaeological revolution that began in the 19th century is still ongoing, with new discoveries continuing to reshape our understanding of ancient history and human achievement. Today we can see patterns in the long history of revolutionary change that stretches from ancient Babylon to the modern world. Foreign conquest followed by cultural synthesis has been a recurring theme throughout human history. When the Persians conquered Babylon, they adopted and adapted Babylonian administrative techniques. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, Greek culture merged with local traditions to create new hybrid civilizations. When the Arabs conquered the Sassanid and Byzantine empires, they preserved and built upon the intellectual achievements of the peoples they ruled. Each conquest brought destruction, but also created opportunities for cultural exchange and innovation. Religious reform has consistently accompanied political change throughout history. The Babylonian exile transformed Judaism, just as the rise of Christianity transformed the Roman Empire, and the spread of Islam transformed the societies of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Religious movements have provided the ideological framework for political and social change, while political upheavals have created the conditions for religious innovation and reform. Technology has repeatedly driven military and social revolution. The bronze weapons and horse-drawn chariots that gave Babylonian armies their edge were eventually superseded by iron weapons and cavalry tactics. The printing press revolutionized the spread of ideas, just as cuneiform writing had done thousands of years earlier. Today, digital technology is creating new forms of communication and knowledge sharing that parallel the revolutionary impact of writing itself. Trade and economics have been consistent forces of revolutionary change. The commercial networks that connected Babylon to the wider world created conditions for the exchange of ideas as well as goods. The wealth generated by trade funded the construction of temples and palaces, supported the development of writing and mathematics, and made possible the leisure time necessary for intellectual and artistic achievement. Modern global trade networks continue to reshape societies and cultures in ways that echo the revolutionary impact of ancient commerce. The Babylonian model reveals important lessons about how civilizations rise and maintain power. Revolutionary innovation in technology, administration, or culture can provide temporary advantages, but long-term success depends on the ability to adapt and incorporate new ideas from other sources. The law codes and administrative systems developed in Babylon proved remarkably durable because they were flexible enough to be adapted to changing circumstances. The careful preservation of records and knowledge allowed Babylonian achievements to survive, even when political power passed to other hands. Cultural continuity despite political upheaval is another crucial lesson from the Babylonian experience. Even when the city of Babylon lost its political independence, its intellectual and cultural traditions continued to influence the wider world. The preservation of knowledge in written form made it possible for ideas to survive the rise and fall of individual empires and dynasties. This insight remains relevant today, as we grapple with rapid technological and social change while trying to preserve the valuable elements of our cultural heritage. The importance of record-keeping for historical understanding cannot be overstated. Our knowledge of Babylonian civilization depends entirely on the written records that Babylonian scribes preserved in their archives. Without these cuneiform tablets, we would know almost nothing about one of history's most influential civilizations. This lesson has profound implications for our own era, as we create vast amounts of digital information while wondering what will survive for future generations to study and understand. The final revolution in Babylon's long history is still unfolding. The transformation of Babylon from a living city to an archaeological site represents a different kind of change, one that has turned physical ruins into symbols and memories into myths. Ancient Babylon has become a powerful symbol in modern political rhetoric, invoked by those who want to criticize the pride and corruption of contemporary societies. The Babylon of popular culture, with its hanging gardens and decadent luxury, often bears little resemblance to the actual ancient city, but this symbolic Babylon has its own power and influence. The digital revolution of the 21st century has created new possibilities for accessing and understanding the legacy of ancient Babylon. Cuneiform tablets are being digitized and made available online, allowing anyone with an internet connection to examine these ancient documents. Machine learning algorithms are being developed to help translate and interpret cuneiform texts, potentially unlocking thousands of documents that have never been fully studied. Virtual reality technology makes it possible to walk through reconstructions of ancient Babylon, experiencing the city as it might have appeared in its prime. New discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of Babylonian civilization and its impact on the wider world. Recent excavations in Iraq have revealed previously unknown aspects of Babylonian urban planning and architecture. Advances in scientific dating techniques have refined our understanding of when key developments took place. The analysis of ancient DNA is beginning to reveal patterns of migration and cultural exchange that were previously invisible. Each new discovery adds another piece to the complex puzzle of human civilization. The continuing story of Babylon's legacy demonstrates that the past is never truly finished. Each generation rediscovers and reinterprets the achievements of their predecessors, finding new relevance and meaning in ancient accomplishments. The Babylonian revolution in writing, mathematics, astronomy and law continues to influence our world today, even as we create new revolutions that will shape the future. The patterns of change that we can observe in Babylonian history provide insights into the forces that drive human progress and the challenges that face all civilizations. From the first cuneiform tablet pressed into clay over 5,000 years ago to the digital databases that preserve Babylonian texts today, the legacy revolution of Babylon continues to unfold. The ideas and innovations that emerged in the land between the rivers have spread throughout the world, transformed by each culture that encountered them, but retaining something of their original power to inspire and instruct. In libraries and universities, in legal codes and astronomical observations, in the very foundations of human knowledge, the revolution that began in ancient Babylon continues to shape our understanding of ourselves and our world. The eternal cycle of revolution, destruction, and renewal that characterized Babylonian history remains a fundamental pattern of human experience, reminding us that every ending contains the seeds of new beginnings.